Oui. Attends. Ouais. J'attends, je suis en direct là. Donc, C, the enforcement of morals. This liberal conclusion will strike some readers as too powerful. They will think that it violates, rather than draws on, the principle. Consider the following argument. The liberal thesis does not respect abstraction because it does not provide people with as much flexibility as possible in the choice of lives to lead. Many people think that a worthy life can be led only in a community whose public culture identifies and prescribes a shared personal morality, which includes, for example, orthodoxy of religious commitment, circumscribed sexual behavior, and traditional gender and class distinctions of role. We noticed, when we considered Rawls's use of the interest strategy, that some philosophers and sociologists claim that a truly desirable life can be led only in an environment of moral and perhaps even religious homogeneity. In most circumstances, a public culture of that sort can be sustained only by outlawing the behavior it deems immoral. In one way, of course, enforcing religion and morals in this illiberal way would offend the abstraction principle. It would altogether prohibit, or at least make much more difficult, the lives members of religious, cultural, or social minorities hope to lead. So it would hide the true cost of the opportunities it makes possible for the majority. But any choice the community makes about whether to enforce a common morality offends the abstraction principle in the same way. Failing to enforce morality would deny the majority the opportunities each wants, and that would distort the true cost of the opportunities then left available to the minority. We must accept that in this sort of case, the principle of abstraction cannot be satisfied in full or unambiguously, because the choice of any liberty-constrained baseline scheme would distort opportunity costs in one direction or another. So we do the best we can for abstraction by balancing the interests of majority and minority against each other in some way. If these conflicting interests are to be balanced, then numbers must affect that balance, and so at least some legal constraints on minority freedom must be accepted to make possible a way of life the majority wishes to have. That is an important challenge to my suggestion that abstraction forbids enforcing an orthodox religion or person. The objection claims to find an anti-liberal impulse in the idea of opportunity costs and therefore at the heart of equality of resources. It is in one way a welcome challenge because it shows that familiar and important political controversies can be modeled from within that conception of equality and can therefore be studied from its perspective. The challenge is valuable in another way as well. It calls attention to a possible, indeed tempting, misunderstanding of the kind of neutrality toward which equality of resources aims. The objection supposes that the principle of abstraction aims to make life equally easy to lead. Then it notices what is certainly true, that this equally easy form of neutrality is impossible, at least under equality of resources, because any choice of a liberty-constrained system will make some lives easier and others harder to lead. Circumstances, it declares, some compromise or balance is necessary between the liberal system I described and a more coercive system a majority might think it needs. But the equally easy form of neutrality plays no role in equality of resources. It belongs to a version of the different conception of equality I called equality. Equality of resources aims at neutrality in a different sense. It aims that the resources people have available with which to pursue their plans or projects or way of life be fixed by the costs of their having these to others, rather than by any collective judgment about the comparative importance of people or the comparative worth of projects or personal moralities. Neutrality in that sense does not guarantee that any kind of life someone might want will be available to him. Someone who wants a life of imperial connoisseurship, assembling massive collections of masterpieces in a private storehouse, will find this impossible under equality of resources. He will not be able to afford the opportunity costs of that way of life, as these are judged in an auction from equal bidding resources, even if he sacrifices everything else. Equality of resources has that consequence, but in virtue of the fact that it is neutral between him and others who also want to study and enjoy works of art. The liberal account of opportunity costs, which is now being challenged, extends that version of neutrality to the social circumstances as well as the discrete resources different ways of life require for success. It allows each person's social requirements, the social setting he claims he needs in order successfully to pursue his chosen way of life, to be tested by asking how far these requirements can be satisfied with an egalitarian structure that measures their cost to others. Someone who wants a life impossible except under a regime of religious intolerance would find that life unavailable for a reason parallel to the argument that denies the connoisseur of all of what he wants. Given that some of his fellow citizens care about their religious or spiritual lives too, but are called to a different religion or none at all, he cannot purchase the environment he believes he needs in an auction whose baseline does not give it to him for nothing in advance. So the baseline scheme I proposed, in which opportunity costs are identified through an auction whose baseline allows no constraints justified on grounds of religion or personal morality, draws a difference between the interests of the orthodox and those of the eccentric that is appropriate to equality of resources. The interests different groups have in the design of the social and cultural environment are accommodated by a price structure for, from, from assumptions neutral among their projects in the sense I described. Numbers will indeed count in the auction conducted from that neutral baseline. Those who crave the protection and reinforcement of religious homogeneity will be able to secure, if their numbers warrant this, some part of what they think they need, just as connoisseurs, if they are sufficiently numerous, will be able to provide themselves with brilliant museums to visit. People devout in a particular faith, who need a community of other committed believers in which to flourish, may find that enough other people share their convictions to enable them to join together in creating a special religious community without benefit of the criminal law. Nor is any minority, whether religious, sexual, or cultural, assured of social requirements ideal for them. Numbers count for them as well. They would plainly be better off, in a variety of ways, if more people shared their views or had tastes that made their own activities less expensive. Their prospects, too, and for the same reason, will depend on the opportunity costs to others, neutrally judged, of what they want. The bridge strategy, therefore, commends the liberal view that the baseline liberty constraint system which should be innocent of any constraints justified on grounds of religious truth or moral virtue. No other conception of true opportunity costs or of moral neutrality fits the basic structure of equality of resources. D. Correction. I must now mention another principle that the liberty constraint system of a proper baseline would recognize, because I will leave the wrong impression of the scope of the principle of abstraction if I ignore that further principle entirely. The principle of correction, as I shall call it, is of great practical importance, but I shall discuss it only in the most vague way, neglecting many problems it presents, because any discussion would divert us from our main project. The auctioneer in the imaginary auction I described faces a serious problem. He knows enough about the projects, ambitions, and plans of the parties to the proposed auction to know that the auction will not be able to achieve and retain a distribution of resources equal in opportunity costs. That aim will be defeated by what economists call externality costs. That aim will be defeated by what economists call externalities. Suppose that one party to the auction, A, intends to build a glass box on a lot in an area otherwise destined to become, because of the tastes and cooperative aims of others who buy lots there, a Georgian square. If his intentions were known, and these others were sufficiently numerous and well organized, they might decide collectively to outbid him for the lot he aims to have. Of course, the auctioneer cannot be sure that they would. A might decide to have the lot at any sacrifice to his other interests, but the auctioneer can know that this is unlikely. The auctioneer also knows that even if that result would be reached in an auction meeting those in realistic conditions about information and organization, it might well not be reached in the actual auction he is about to commence, for A's intentions might not be transparent. Or A might not have the desire to build his glass box when he acquires his lot, but only from that desire later. Or A might sell the lot at some later time to someone who buys it for that purpose. The result that would be reached with perfect predictive knowledge might not be reached for another reason: the costs of forming groups collectively to bid against A. I have generally ignored transaction costs in the auction story, but they would be particularly large in cases of this sort. In these circumstances, the auctioneer might decide to limit freedom of choice in the baseline system of liberties and constraints, just for the purpose of correcting the auction in advance toward a result that better reflects opportunity costs as they would be revealed in an auction of perfect knowledge and costless organizational transactions. His intervention might take a variety of forms, some of which would be better suited than others to that end. He might adopt general zoning ordinances, for example, attempting to anticipate land use as this would be determined by a perfect auction. He might respond to other, different forms of auction imperfection by fixing new, different kinds of constraints in the baseline. He might anticipate, for example, that some parties would use materials they acquired in the auction in ways that would pollute the atmosphere to the injury of neighbors who, if they could predict the polluter's actions and could organize efficiently, would collectively outbid them for that material. The auctioneer might use the tort law of the liberty constraint system to make such pollution an actionable nuisance. This device would correct for externality in a more subtle way because it will leave open the possibility that a polluter could bargain with those affected for a right to pollute. The ground I am now haphazardly racing over is, of course, familiar terrain to students of the literature of law and economics. I mean only to suggest the connection between that literature and the principle of correction. Constraints on freedom of choice are required and justified, according to that principle, if they improve the degree to which equality of resources secures its goal, which is to achieve a genuinely equal distribution measured by true opportunity costs. The analysis sketched in this paragraph would seem adequate to justify, within the general framework of equality of resources, constraints serving purposes somewhat different from these examples, for resolving different forms of prisoner's dilemma, for example, and for justifying traffic regulations, like one-way systems, that aim to protect convenience or efficiency rather than only safety or security. So this is different. Improving the accuracy of the auction in this way would not entail, of course, reaching the exact results that would have been reached if the conditions of ideal knowledge and organization had been met. Those who gain from the constraints, those who do not want glass boxes in Georgian squares, would have paid nothing from their initial stock of resources for their success. So a regulatory constraint or an article of tort law is justified under the principle of correction only if there are good grounds for supposing that the corruption of the opportunity cost test would be less with the constraint in place than it would be without it. It is justified, that is, only if there are good grounds for supposing that people's resources, at the end of the auction and thereafter, would be closer to the results of the super-imaginary pre-auction auction we are now contemplating, in which all motives are transparent, all transactions are predictable, and organizational costs are the auctioneer typically does have one reason to suppose that distortion would be less severe if he adopts constraints correcting for externality. In most cases of externality, the windfall that would be produced by a constraint would be spread among more people than the windfall that would result with no constraint. Through constraints would roughly even out these windfalls better than a general practice of ignoring the externalities would. Under the former practice, A would benefit from other anti-nuisance constraints, for example, but under the latter, A's neighbors might be left with no externality windfalls at all to compensate them for their immediate externality loss. What? Vous m'entendez? You still hear me? Three cautions seem wise. This is named acne in French. How do you say that in English?